So there's been a leaked report from RICU, the Home Office's Research, Information and Communications Unit, otherwise known as the government's propaganda department that I've spoken about for a long time, which has said that claims of two-tier policing are a far-right conspiracy theory and that grooming gangs are just a grievance narrative that folks like us have invented. Now, this should be old news because actually I've been reporting on this particular report for quite some time. This was Stephen Edgington's first leaks. This was back in November, on the 15th of November, and I then amplified it for my reporting, both on this channel and on Courage Media. Some of the other things that were included in this report were calling anti-communist views far-right. So that should tell you exactly who's running Britain's deep state, and believe me, we have one and it's worse than America's. Quote, discussing extreme right-wing views, the Home Office cited cultural nationalism as an example, defining the term as the main belief being that Western culture is under threat from mass migration. The paper warned that right-wing extremist narratives, particularly around immigration and policing, are in some cases leaking into mainstream debates, and they cited two-tier policing as that example. Now, it's funny that that's apparently a far-right conspiracy theory, because how many times on this channel have we gone over the fact that the Met Police have expressly said, be it the Macpherson report or their recent commitments to DEI in the wake of George Floyd, that we're going to police communities much lighter. So it's both a conspiracy theory and it's explicit government policy.
Well, they're also talking about it like it's some form of contagion, as if, you know, there's this radioactive thing and it's slowly seeping into the ordinary population. Isn't it terrible?
Yeah, it's almost like people pointing out the problem and not the problem, but the problem is in fact the problem. But nope, you've got to be censored and called far-right for talking about it. And of course, Edgington points out here that the memo was authored by RICU, based in the Home Office. And RICU, for those who don't know, are the parent body of Prevent. So this should give you some insight into why Prevent has been all but refusing to monitor Islamist extremism. And it might have something to do with the staff of Prevent, which we'll get into shortly. Now, Stephen Edgington got Labour to denounce this at the time. So they've since come out and denounced the leak again of the original leak. But at the time, they ran screaming from this because they realised, even before the grooming gangs discourse went global, because Elon Musk noticed it on X, that this was a terrible thing to say, you know, the thousands of girls raped by imported Pakistani Muslim criminals is just a grievance narrative that we've made up. But, as we always know, this is just a de jure denouncement. De facto, they still believe it. So they're still going to do this exact same thing. Because Yvette Cooper is pictured there. She's the Home Secretary, for those outside of the UK, in the US. She commissioned this report in the first place in the wake of the Southport protests and riots to say, how can we record more non-crime hate incidents? So these are the guidelines by which she's instructed her own civil servants to encourage the increased policing of thought crime because some absolute nutcase that the Home Office failed to stop went and murdered 3 girls and stabbed about 8 others. Great, love living in this country. I've been covering this story quite a lot, actually, over on lotuseaters.com behind the paywall. So this is that episode on RICU, so if you want to know the background to that, you can watch how the government gaslights you. This is the one on the history of non-crime hate incidents, and this is the one particularly on the Islamic network of Muslim activists in the Home Office, and we'll be returning to those shortly. That woman there is a woman called Dame Sarah Khan. She was the government's former independent anti-extremism advisor. So independent that her sister was also running RICU at the time. And they were the ones bankrolling Hope Not Hate while they were inventing the Islamophobia definition, which said that the grooming gangs, discourse around the grooming gangs, should be banned because it's an anti-Muslim conspiracy theory.
Very interesting to appoint someone who, presumably with the surname Khan, has a Pakistani background.
Yes.
As someone able to define what extremism is. Because surely people know that Pakistan's actually a hotbed of Islamic extremism, right?
One would think. So the person who appointed her was Michael Gove.
Oh, of course.
So having spoken to people trying to be familiar with Gove's thinking at the time, I think Gove thought that he was like the perfect puppet master to sit between two communities of marginalising Islamic extremism while giving certain Muslims who he thought could be seen as mainstream greater positions of prominence to try and contain the Islamist element. But what ended up happening is they just packed the Home Office full of Muslim staff members who then corresponded with Islamist groups and gave them a larger quota than if you just never spoken to them in the first place.
Of course, and if you had any common sense or any observations of how these sorts of things work, you could have predicted that quite easily.
Yes, but, you know, other
Michael
people,
Gove.
other than us, have larger in-group ethnic and religious preference, and it seems that all of the Western white liberal-leaning elites have ignored that and just sleptwalked us into dystopia. So I'm going to go through the details of this policy exchange report because it bears reading, and the PDF that Samson has so gladly brought up. So this was the government's rapid analytical sprint to determine its policy based on extremism. It was leaked to policy exchange.
So just right off the bat, rapid analytical sprint. That is such a juxtaposition of terms. You can't be analytical in a rapid or quick way.
You can if you've got an ideological cookie cutter that you're just impressing on the world. Like, you can quickly stamp it out like that.
That's an immediate red flag right off the bat.
Oh, there's many more. Again, it was commissioned by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, who should be made to resign immediately, but she should have gone ages ago anyway. The longest of the documents, seen by Policy Exchange, is titled Counter-Extremism Sprint Understand. Not really an honest inquiry, as we'll come to see, but there you go. And this was authored by Prevent and Raiku and the Homeland Security Analysis and Insight Team, which is the HSAI. So they've got some definitions of extremism here. Understand lists 9 types of extremism in the following order: Islamist, extreme right-wing, extreme misogyny, pro-Khalistan extremism, Hindu nationalism, extremism, so the Hindutva, environmental extremism, left-wing, anarchist, and single-issue extremism, violence fascination, and conspiracy theories. Now, those aren't necessarily in like descending order or anything.
That's quite a mismatch as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to cover a whole broad spectrum of things at once, and they're not doing any of them very well. In the section on the extreme right wing, Sprint enters difficult waters in declaring that claims of two-tier policing, where groups are allegedly treated differently after similar behaviour, are an example of a right-wing extremist narrative leaking into mainstream debates. So, for example, if you notice that the police apply different standards to Palestine protests, or if you just cite things like the Alexis J report, which say that the police were too afraid of accusations of racism to step in and actually police the Pakistani rape gangs, despite citing government documents in the UK, you are being surveilled by the government as a right-wing extremist. So if you're citing their own documents back to them, you're on a watch list, which we probably are.
Oh, almost certainly.
Yeah, quite interesting that, isn't it? Sprint also categorises the far right as, quote, hijacking extant local grievances about perceived inequalities around access to resources, e.g. benefits, migrant hotels, etc. Ah, yes. Just perceived inequalities when in certain regions of London, about 76% of social housing is going to first-generation migrants. Overall in London, it's about 50%. Just perceived inequalities. We're just pulling it out of our backside with all of the demographic maps and stats.
I mean, for a specific community, isn't it 71% for Somalis in London?
It was 72.
72. I might be off by
them.
It could be going up. It could be 73 by now.
We actually don't know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Rupert Lowe's been procuring a lot of this data, and he's found that, for example, 40% of immigrants that came in 2022 to 2023 are already on benefits.
Wonderful.
So per capita, guys, not perceived, but there you go. As well, fascinating when you say about the grooming gangs and, you know, Pakistanis being in charge of the Home Office anti-extremism unit. They might not want to address that issue. Quote, there's little reference to the grooming gangs in here. It's hard to see how progress can be made on reducing violence against women, for example, and ensuring public confidence, unless countering grooming gangs and difficult questions that involves a part of the programme. The main mention of the subject in the leaked documents is that, quote, right-wing extremists frequently exploit cases of alleged group-based sexual abuse to promote anti-Muslim sentiment, as well as anti-government and anti-political correctness narratives. So they don't believe it's even happening. Despite the prosecutions, despite all the witness testimonies, despite the copious amounts of evidence, despite the fact that Home Secretary Suella Braverman set up a joint task force of 43 police forces in England and Wales, and in the first year arrested 550 people and identified 4,000 victims, their official policy is it's not even happening.
It's very insulting that they use the word exploit to the people who are victimised by this, the people who have to live in those communities as well and know people. Could you imagine reading that and saying that people are exploiting it? It's just a grievance. There's not a legitimate concern. I'd like to see the people who wrote this actually say that to one of the victims of the grooming gangs face to face.
What's fascinating is, so Telford MP Lucy, I've forgotten her last name, I do apologise. She told The Telegraph when she started speaking out about the rape gangs in her local area, because Telford's one of the most notorious ones, Baroness Saida Vorsi summoned her and said, explain yourself. Now, it's interesting to note that Baroness Saida Vorsi, when she was chairwoman of the Conservative Party in 2011, her deputy, her chief of staff, Richard Chalk, became the head of Raiku after he'd come back from running PSYOPs in Iraq for Bill Pottinger. So he decided to, rather than run PSYOPs on behalf of the Iraq war, come back and run PSYOPs on the population. Sorry, Harry, you look completely just zoned out.
I mean, I've not really got much to say on all of this. It's typical, isn't it?
Understandable. So here's the most revealing part of this. Why do you think that they've said that these are all grievance narratives?
Because they're attacking the government and diversity, and these are things that should not be questioned and therefore are problems.
You basically bang on. They said it's, quote, preventing integration. So pointing out the downsides of immigration, diversity, like all the rapes, that's what's stopping integration. So you noticing the problem, again, is what's stopping integration. If the far-right racists wouldn't complain about all the children being raped, we'd all be singing John Lennon's Imagine, I suppose. The behaviours and activity of concern, and this is the quote, and damaging extremist beliefs listed in the various documents include a vast constellation of attitudes and acts, among them conspiracy theories, misogyny, violence against women and girls, having a fixture on gore and violence without adherence to an extremist ideology, preventing integration, influencing racism and intolerance, or involvement in an online subculture called the manosphere. And then they decide to list all things like incels, pickup artists, because for some reason, Labour politicians like Jess Phillips and Yvette Cooper have a myopic obsession of Andrew Tate clips coming up on their Twitter.
I mean, Keir Starmer did say last week that these are the government's new prime targets for terror.
Yeah, it's funny. Sarah Khan in December.
No, incels.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, if you can't get a girlfriend, you're a terrorist.
Well, that was Rudy Cabana's biggest problem, wasn't it? That he was an incel.
Yes, definitely. Based on his search history, literature, all of that, definitely that's the main takeaway.
It was either that he was an incel or that he may have speculatively smoked weed once.
I have confirmation that he didn't.
What a surprise.
Yeah, there's literally, he was never under the influence of drugs. As far as we know, coming from his internet history, he wasn't visiting like r/pol or anything like that. So
the government wants you to think it's got to be anything except mass migration, religious extremism, or just anti-white hatred, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny that the conspicuous absence of something. Are you noticing that something's not really getting mentioned here?
Yes.
So, the case studies they include in the Understand paper include one of about 430 words on leafleting and stickering campaigns by two far-right groups, so presumably that's like Sam Melia or something like that, right? And another of about 320 words on the hundreds of Punish a Muslim Day posts, which tell mama, personal, constant, chronic liars, because they said that Boris Johnson's letterbox column caused anti-Muslim hate events, when what they meant is a phone line had an increased report of Muslims saying they were offended. Great, thanks. Tell Mama reported that Punish a Muslim Day had resulted in one single incident of school bullying. So this is top priority for Prevent, right? The only Islamist case study in here, the only one, is Anjem Chowdhury's Al Madroon. Anjem Chowdhury is currently in prison. So no mention of like 2017 London Bridge or Westminster Bridge attacks, no mention of the Manchester Arena bombing, barely any mention of the grooming gangs other than to say it's a far-right conspiracy theory. Wonder why they don't want to talk about Islamist extremism at all. Very weird. No mention of the Batley Grammar School teacher who's still in hiding, which, by the way, Batley Grammar School teacher in hiding has received less support than Axel Rudakabana's parents have from the state.
That's infuriating, isn't it?
Yep. Just traitors run the government. Conspicuous absence of focus on Muslim terrorism, basically, is what I'm getting at. Despite, as the authors of this paper, Andrew Gilligan and Dr. Paul Stott remind us, in the UK, Islamists are responsible for 94% of all terror deaths and 88% of terror injuries since 1999.
Allow me to also add a more updated version, because I did my own calculation of this. And since 2005, when the IRA bombings stopped, when the things returned to somewhat normal relations with Ireland, it is, I think, 96.97% of all terror-related fatalities have an Islamist perpetrator.
There you go. And 80% of the open case files for counter-terror police, and 75% of open case files for MI5, and 63% of terrorists currently in custody are Muslim. So that's inconvenient fact, and yet Prevent, Raiku, just not bothered. Actually, Understand devotes the exact same amount of page space, one page, to Islamist extremism as to conspiracy theories, pro-Khalistan extremism, Sikh extremism, extreme misogyny and environmental extremism, which, as far as we know, have caused absolutely no deaths. So, yeah, there you go. Now, I've been reporting on this for quite a while because this has tangible consequences. So, how many of you guys have heard of the Shawcross report? It was a review of Prevent.
Heard of it, yes.
Yeah.
So Shawcross, I put this in a very long study of Raiku, basically. But Shawcross found that, and this is a quote, Prevent is not doing enough to counter non-violent Islamist extremism, and has applied a double standard when dealing with the extreme right-wing and Islamism. By the way, they define extreme right-wing via a list of texts leaked in 2019 they called Actively Patriotic and Proud, as reading Douglas Murray, Peter Hitchens, Melanie Phillips, J.R.R. Tolkien, Beowulf, and George Orwell's 1984. So if you read any of those, you're a terrorist, but if you read the Quran and Hadiths, nope, just fine by them, that's fine. And he said, the present boundaries around what is termed by Prevent as extremist Islamist ideology are drawn too narrowly, while the boundaries around the ideology of the extreme right wing are far too broad. When discussing Islamism, Prevent staff frequently came back to issues relating to mental health concerns and vulnerabilities. That, by the way, is the largest share of referrals now, just this nebulous mental health thing. Ideology, if acknowledged at all, was treated as a secondary factor and a derivative of a wider psychological or social issue. Put simply, ideology was not seen as an essential part of the trajectory towards terrorism. Instead, it was viewed as one of many potential radicalizing factors.
They do realize how terrorism works, right? And how it actually gets its name is that you invoke terror on a population because of the sort of unprovoked violence. So that sort of implies that it's being done for a reason, doesn't it? There's intention built into the term. And so they've completely misunderstood the very definition of the word they're meant to be.
Well, it's only their job, Josh.
Yeah,
You could say it's a misunderstanding, or you could say it's purposeful obfuscation.
I was being a bit charitable there.
Oh, I understand. And I think it's fine to be charitable until we go on. So, because of this, under the Khan sisters, turns out that Prevent referrals dropped for Islamist extremism. Only 22% of Prevent referrals in 2020 to 2021 were for Islamic extremism, and 25% of them were for the far right, despite far right making up only 10% of counter police's open investigations, and Islamic extremism, again, being 80%. And, of course...
And I would assume within the far right there, you are lumping people like Sam Melia putting out stickers.
Yes, I mean... Do we remember that training video that they sent out a little while ago where it said that a 17-year-old boy is putting up anti-migration stickers in a public park, so call Prevent on him?
Ridiculous, isn't it? I'm just looking up because in 2021, the terror threat went up by 90% when they reclassified things to include the far right and right-wing extremism, which meant that the number of pensioners on the list went up 90%, sorry. That was the actual figure. So all of these pensioners who are probably not even physically capable of carrying out a terror attack were put on this list because they wanted to seem even-handed. And in fact, I believe someone who is a former head of the Cobra emergency meeting group said this is basically just being done for political reasons. The threat is not equivalent to Islamic extremism. Well, and this is someone who is Colonel Richard Kemp,
yes,
a terror expert.
Funny that he got sued by Saeed Avorsi for libel for suggesting that she was liaising with Muslim groups that she herself called, although not illegal, clearly illiberal. So funny how that interplays, isn't it? Anyway, point being, I actually met a civil servant while I was out in DC who had worked at the Department of Trade and got referred to Prevent for having a photo of Jacob Rees-Mogg in his office. That is how low the bar is for the far right.
You mean the man who was...
Doesn't care about demographic change? Yeah.
Senior frontbench Conservative MP and GB News panellist.
Does owning a top hat put you on the list as well?
The fat controller on Suicide Watch.
So... We can laugh about this, and it's worth us doing so, but remember, this means that Islamists and people of diverse extraction don't quite get monitored by Prevent. And the most tragic examples of this are, of course, Abi Harbi Ali, the son of the Somalian diplomat who in 2021 murdered Sir David Amess MP at a constituency surgery over his vote on Libya. He'd actually been stalking Michael Gove the day before as well. So the great irony is that Michael Gove enabled this situation and was nearly killed by the exact kind of person that Prevent let go after one meeting with no follow-up. And then there's Axel Ruda-Cabana, who's referred to Prevent 3 times between 2019 and 2021, despite owning ISIS materials, being obsessed with white genocide, telling classmates he wanted white genocide, carrying a knife into school 10 times, being excluded, then coming back on the school grounds and breaking a classmate's wrist with a hockey stick. Again, absolutely no follow-up to this referral. Is it because of the possession of his materials and the colour of their skin? Prevent just decided to overlook it because they thought it might be racist to look into it. Weird, that. So I've got some evidence, possibly, of this happening. So we'll go back to the Policy Exchange report, because these are the recommendations they made. They say that responsibility for counter-extremism moves back to the Home Office, because under the Conservatives, Michael Gove moved it to his department. There's going to be a creation of a counter-extremism ministerial board featuring Dan Jarvis MP, MBE MP, Jess Phillips, our old friend, who absolutely has a very sane definition of things, Vet Cooper, obviously, Prevent Director Michael Stewart, who has overseen this decline in Islamist referrals, and representatives from GCHQ, MI5, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, and the Charity Commission. The Charity Commission on there means you're going to get a bunch of left-wing activist NGOs setting the definition, like Hope Not Hate, who did the Islamophobia definition in the first place. And they also want to make a new crime of making harmful communications online, which was originally rejected as part of the online safety bill, and the Conservatives, and now they want to bring it back. And they want to increase the number of non-crime hate incidents recorded.
What do you mean? Curious wording there. Making online communications, as in just you communicating online? Is it just a weird way of saying that, or is that you're creating resources to be communicated, like infographics or things like that?
Is this an anti-meme legislation?
Yes.
It kind of sounds like it.
Basically, if you share online misinformation that causes real-world harm, like people sharing the incorrect identity of the Southport perpetrator as some Syrian migrant, they weren't being able to be prosecuted under the current law. They want to make a law so they can be prosecuted. So if you get something wrong on the internet and it offends a minority, you can go to prison. That's what they want to do, right? Yvette Cooper promised to increase the number of non-crime hate incidents being recorded, by the way, in August 2024. She's going to run into some problems because an act of parliament changed the law. But as I've covered recently, even though Suella Braverman tried to make it better, what she did was she asked the police to record non-crime hate incidents using common sense and not to record it when it's clearly malicious. Now, the problem is, under the Equality Act, if you've got protected characteristics, the police are told not to engage in secondary victimization by asking you for evidence. So it just went up. Turns out, after the guidance trying to improve things, the number of non-crime hate incidents went up. So didn't quite go so great. After Alison Pearson got a knock on the door from the police for an anti-Hamas tweet, it was found that last year, 13,000 non-crime hate incidents were recorded. That was an increase from 11,000 from before the guidance. So police who haven't solved one burglary in the majority of constituencies in England and Wales are obsessed with policing tweets.
I would love to find out just how many the Lotus Eaters have got. We could have a little league table go on.
You can actually send off an FOI request and find out. I found out that I didn't get one lodged against me after I almost got arrested in 2022 outside Conservative Party conference, but I wouldn't be shocked if I've got one since. And these do bar you from public sector employment, by the way, so people know. And bear in mind,
no risk of that.
Oh, well, Josh and I are fine then.
Yeah, well, bear in mind that the UK now has more civil servants per capita than communist China, so the public sector is swelling, and so they're just essentially ideologically gatekeeping.
Communists are more efficient.
Is that true?
Yes.
The communist Chinese have a leaner state.
Yes.
A country that's the size of an empire with a ridiculously large population, less civil servants.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And also, we've got more diversity and inclusion.
Makes so much sense.
We've got more diversity and inclusion commissars than any other country in the world right now, especially after Trump has just defunded them all. So we are just, as Morgoth has said, woke North Korea. And so you can't work for the state if you've got one of these increasing
the
numbers.
North Korean state's leaner than ours at this rate.
Yeah. So,
well, I mean, they've not got much food to go around.
Yeah. Speaking of people working hand in glove with the state, this also coincides with, and Sarah Khan.
Again, we won't either soon.
True, fair point. Sarah Khan has also been involved in a BBC undercover investigation of Patriotic Alternative. Now, we can think that Patriotic Alternative are not a particularly credible group to govern, and we can think that Mark Collett did some unsavoury things in the past, and I wouldn't trust him to run a bath than a government department. But it's funny that
I still don't think they should be under government investigation for being a political party that offends people.
During this process, the guy who went undercover as part of the BBC was down and out on his luck, and so members of PA asked, "Do you want us to find you a job?" and things like that.
Oh, they were nice to him.
Yes.
And he still submitted his investigation smearing them.
Well, the purpose of this investigation, so state media is working with the state here, and Dame Sarah Khan, who's still independent, but is obviously working with Hope Not Hate, who are Home Office funded to create reports to say, here, you should ban certain people. Sarah Khan is quoted in here, funnily enough. Former Counter-Extremism Commissioner Dame Sarah Khan believes the UK government should urgently change the law to make groups like Patriotic Alternative illegal. So she wants to prescribe them as a terror group. So actual referrals for Islamist groups went down under her watch. They literally missed terrorists like Abi Harbi Ali and Axel Ruda Cabana, but we're going to prescribe Patriotic Alternative as a terror group because basically the demand for far-right terrorists outstrips the supply.
Also, I will say it's not... So you're telling me that Dame Khan, classic British name, wants to make a group that specifically stands up for the rights of ethnically British people illegal?
You said exactly what I was going to say.
I could never have guessed that such a thing would happen. I'm so glad that we put women like her in positions of power.
And one does not need to support Patriotic Alternative to notice that, let's say, malicious ethnic and religious preference, which only ever cuts one way. And I say it only ever cuts one way.
I'm sorry, Josh, you're so right. It is always just about resource acquisition, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and this is access to political resource.
Mm-hmm. Well, I say it only ever cuts one way because under Khan's leadership, something called the Home Office Islamic Network, which I've been shouting about for a while.
The fact that exists at all.
It's now got 700 members. And guess where they mainly work? Riku and Prevent.
In Bradford, I imagine.
Well, yeah.
Hey, Birmingham as well. Come on.
That's true.
Yeah, possibly. So here's some things that happened under Khan's watch. While Khan and her sister were running the Home Office and Prevent and Riku, Hope Not Hate received grants of £50,000 and £141,380 in 2019 and 2020 to brief multiple departments on emerging trends in UK hate. At that time, they were working with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islamophobia, which was headed by Wes Streeting, is now headed by, drumroll, Saeed Avorsi, to invent an Islamophobia definition, which said that if you talk about grooming gangs, you're making racist remarks against the Muslim community in Britain. So they were just being paid by the government to ban any conversation about grooming gangs. And then they also received payments of £240,000, £275,000 and £60,000 from the Paul Hamlin Foundation, who themselves are funded by the Home Office. They're a pro-migration charity. And that was part of the Foundation's migration fund to create, and I quote, a UK network of young migrant leaders and a network of leaders and organisations within towns who will respond to local needs and pressure points and share learning to enable rapid response to provocative elements. Translation, they create little protest splinter groups to respond once, I don't know, another protest kicks off about diversity, multiculturalism or Islam. So then these very well-principled anti-racist activists can stand out there with pre-printed placards, get a photo, and suddenly it appears on a newspaper front page.
It reminds me of when all of the riots were going on in August,
August
and
8th.
all of the anti-immigration people seemed to be organic in that all of their signs, if they did have signs, which many of them didn't, seemed to be homemade, handmade, and different, holding different messages. And then the other side all had stand up to racism signs or basically carbon copies of one another. The whole thing seemed like it was centrally organised because lots of people at lots of different times all turned up at these pre-planned places with the same signs.
And they always have Handmaid's Tale outfits as well.
You mean that one?
Yep.
Yeah, this one, yeah.
Yeah, funny that.
This was classic. Every single newspaper on the exact same day had the same front page.
Yeah, and
It's almost like it's government orchestrated, isn't
well,
it?
so I put in an FOI request about this actually, and they told me we had no input into the headlines. I was like, that's not what I asked though. You sidestepped that one. And the reason I asked that is because Dame Sarah Khan specifically set this trend of the Riku unit controlling newspaper front pages. Because as you can see here, here's Dame Sarah Khan's charity called Inspire. She did the hashtag Making a Stand campaign. Theresa May helped launch it. The Home Office and Riku, they called it a Riku product in internal emails. And then when Alan Henning was beheaded by ISIS in 2014, guess what showed up on the front page of The Sun?
Funny that, isn't it?
It's literally Sarah Khan's image that they made in advance in collaboration with the Home Office. Also, under Sarah Khan, that Home Office Islamic network grew, and this was reported by GB News a little while ago. Again, by Stephen Edgington. So people are just sort of catching on now. Patrick Christis decided to report this yesterday, but this was reported in November by me and Stephen. Here's a quote that's absolutely wild. Home Office whistleblower told GB News, having an Islamic lobby group inside the Home Office represents a serious threat to the government's aims in combating Islamic extremism and granting asylum to those fleeing Islamic countries over religious persecution. And the network themselves say that they aim to, quote, promote the recruitment, retention, and progression of Muslim staff in the Home Office and influence policymakers so that policy is more inclusive of Muslim needs.
Remember, guys, don't do identity politics.
Yeah.
Identity politics is bad and it's illiberal. Englishmen are liberal, so don't do identity politics. Just let all of these other groups who hate you organise against you on identity basis. And that's what liberalism and democracy is about, right?
Yeah, and it's funny that so when they were called up on the fact that they were stopping monitoring Islamic extremism by William Shawcross, the Home Office then set up a seminar in King's College London, and so members of the Islamic network went. And I'll finish on this. In January 2024, at a King's College London course called Issues in Countering Terrorism for the civil servants, a lecturer described William Shawcross as the type of person who would say all current counter-terrorism professionals are woke. He is of that ilk. And the same lecturer asked, how do we censor Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray? So society needs to find other ways to suppress them. And then in response, a civil servant had said, and this is a quote, she had argued that Prevent is inherently racist because it focuses on Islamist extremism. And then a few minutes later, when they played an ISIS recruitment video, she pointed at the screen and laughed and went, I know him, he went to my school. These are the people running our government. They know literal ISIS terrorists. They went to the same school.
Were her parents related at all?
We wouldn't know, I'm afraid.
No,
we wouldn't know. Probably. We wouldn't.
I'm just thinking because that seems like a very stupid thing to say immediately after accusing us of being racist.
Yeah. Well, so basically, the conclusion of this story is that the Labour government have now denounced this report a second time. But again, we know that this is their intention because they commissioned the report. Everyone who's done the report is staying in their job. And the Home Office Islamic network that actually run this country and allow Islamist terrorists to slip through the net, according to William Shawcross, in liaise with actual prescribed jihadist group Hizb ut-Tahrir that Keir Starmer represented pro bono as a lawyer while working as the director of public prosecutions. They're basically just allowing terrorists to run riot in Britain. So that's who's really running the country. Fun.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.